Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Today, my darlings, I'm bringing you the first half of a story by Bear Lair 64. They're the ones that did that wonderful porcine horror. This one is entitled Mrs. Richmond's Sinister Garden Gnomes and Creepy Cats. First half. Bear Lockhart. When Mrs. Richmond's home came up for sale, I saw it as a perfect opportunity. It was in the neighborhood where my wife and I had grown up, right next door to my parents. I could care for them, yet not have to live in the same house, nor consign them to a tiny house in our backyard. My wife Karen, who'd grown up nearby, agreed and was happy that we and our soon-to-be 3 children would live in a wholesome community, free from the many hazards of urban living. The city had grown and morphed over the years, devouring all in its path, like some eldritch monster from a Lovecraft tale. There was still a small patch of woods behind the backyard fence, then a creek that had been dug out into a drainage bayou, then a line of trees followed by a strip mall. Great. Convenient, but I preferred the patch of woods in which we'd played and built forts and swings as children. The edge of the city, still far from home. Though the city encroached more each year, it seemed that the Amblewood community remained as it always was, trapped in time and perfect for raising a young family. Poor Mrs. Richmond was plagued with some sort of dementia, and her children had placed her in a retirement home. Mr. Richmond had died long ago, before I even started high school. Some sort of accident at home? Her daughter made the deal. Mrs. Burton was around the same age as my parents, and Karen and I had played with her children when they'd come to visit Grandma and Grandpa Richmond. She was pleased that the good kid next door to Mama wanted the home. Part of the deal was that any of her mother's belongings that remained were part of the sale, and we'd be responsible for disposing of them. Oh, it's up to you. My sisters and I, and all of our children, have had our chance to pick over the place, and Mama gave us most of what we wanted over the years. I'd recommend a garage sale. Mama has some cool stuff. Maybe a donation? Again, whatever y'all want to do with it. Of course we will, ma'am. I couldn't imagine of disposing of Mrs. Richmond's property with anything less than love and care. She was always nice to us, especially to my siblings and me. So many fond memories. At this, I rubbed my slightly soft belly on an otherwise fit form, and so many baked treats. I laughed in what I hoped was a reassuring tone. Apparently it was. After all, I sincerely meant what I'd said. She smiled gratefully and thanked me. We let the bank do most of the work to finalize our deal. On the day she gave us the keys, she paused for a moment. Mama has some cats that would come around and she'd feed 'em. Most have probably moved on to better prospects, but if you catch any loitering, that's why. If you like 'em, maybe you can adopt them as much as they will allow. You know how cats are. I just smiled and nodded. I didn't really care for cats. I was a dog man, and we only waited on getting a dog until we had a house rather than an apartment. We were soon owners of a 1982 ranch-style home in an older but still nice neighborhood. Karen, our 2 little ones, Elizabeth, Ellie, 4, and William, Will, 2, and I moved in shortly. Grandma and Grandpa were over the moon. My older sister lived in the city, so they saw her children regularly, but our older brother had moved out west, and we only saw him and his family about twice per year, not counting online. Now the peals of their grandchildren's laughter and piping voices would be a regular joy for them. When the joy and laughter turned to tears and brattiness, I was sure they'd help. Mrs. Richmond didn't leave all that much, and her stuff, that we didn't adopt, fit into a corner of the garage. The house needed some updates, but for now, with the kids so young, we could shuffle rooms until everything was done. This home was an ant farm for people, all rectangles and straight lines, with each room fit to its own separate purpose. It would take some work to modernize it, and more money than we had at the moment. However, it was on the best part of the cul-de-sac with the largest yard. Perhaps we could get a dog soon. I'd love that. I worked in the city, but on the side closest to home, so the daily commute wasn't completely horrifying. And while I enjoyed work, it was work. So far, I spent far too many hours at the office, and I would have to for some time to rebuild our accounts after buying the house. Karen had decided to stay home until the children were old enough to be off to school. Karen now did some online work and school, and with boundless energy. She still wanted the yard, so did I. Her parents were out of the picture. Her mother had died and her father had split after the divorce and was lost to us. Well, maybe not a loss. For all the work that the house would need, the yard was, well, immaculate. Mrs. Richmond must have spent a considerable portion of her limited income on landscaping. It was surrounded by an 8-foot-tall board fence that still appeared fresh and yellow, no graying boards or weathering. 2 old oak trees, one on each of the 2 back corners, dominated the yard. There were sprays of flowering plants and some smaller trees, and to one side a small fountain with ceramic figurines of cats attached to a nearby dogwood tree. At the foot of that tree stood a garden gnome, smiling around a pipe in its mouth, but with an otherwise mildly sinister expression. I wasn't sure we'd be keeping that. Then I noticed the others. There were 4 more of the creepy little fellows placed around the yard, one near each of the old oaks, one by an azalea bush, one near the back patio besides a potted rose. Each was unique and wore its own expression and clothes, and held onto its own work instrument. A pick for the first, a shovel, a rake, a hoe, and a hatchet for the rest of the lot in turn. Each one wore some version of a smile or smirk, and each one projected a wicked air in its own way. Definitely have to lose those. The clear area in the middle of the yard was very clear, short, perfectly trimmed San Agustin grass. Exquisite. It would be our place to be together and recharge while the kiddos napped or just played by us. Those garden gnomes, though. Ugh. The sky seemed to darken for a moment, and an unseasonable chill clutched at my shoulders. As I turned to go inside, something caught my eye. A glimmer and a hint of movement near one of the oaks. At first it looked absurdly as though the garden gnome had moved. Then I saw the cat sitting on a limb that ran parallel to the top of the fence. It was a big black Tom. Naturally, a black cat. Just what we needed on our first day. It stared at me intently, but blankly, as cats tend to do, but it blinked first, I'm sure. Ha! I won that contest. Then it started licking a paw, and then the ominous feeling that had been creeping up on me waned, and I went back inside our new home. The darkening was just a cloud, the chill, just one of those things. Maybe someone had walked across my future grave. Wait, did the gnome by the cat tree always have its eyes rolled upward? Maybe. Whatever, time to get our first meal in the new house started. While Ellie and Will napped, Karen and I prepared our midday repast. Kay, did you ever play with us in Mrs. Richmond's backyard?" She searched her memory for a moment. "No, I don't think we ever set foot in her backyard, much less played in it." "I thought so," I continued. "Come to think of it, until we started looking at the house, I've never set foot back there either. Never even sneaked a look over the fence. Just never felt curious about it. Odd. You know how nosy I was as a kid." "What changed? You're still nosy," she teased, as she bumped the side of her hip against mine. Her hips were pleasantly broad and her tummy just showing a little baby bump at about 4 months. That was another looming expense. Once again, my curiosity faded for a time, and we had a fun first meal in our new home. As I was falling asleep later that evening, I had an almost startling thought. I was too tired for a full-on startle. Why hadn't I noticed the garden gnomes when Mrs. Burton showed us the backyard? Had she shown us the backyard? I don't really remember looking at it. Maybe I just assumed I knew what it looked like. Sleepy. My sleep was filled with dreams of garden gnomes and stray black cats. The haunting sounds of garden tools striking flesh and the scratching of sharp claws, with occasional yowls and deep-voiced chatter in some guttural tongue that was almost familiar. I awakened in a cold sweat. Karen was sleeping soundly beside me. No nightmares for her. I rose and used the restroom, then checked in on our babes. They slept like little logs with barely a twitch. Karen had left the window in each room cracked open just a bit, and the curtains billowed in Ellie's room. Her window faced the backyard. Apparently the air was refreshing with a strong breeze. I closed the window in each room and quietly padded back to my room and into bed beside my wonderful, hard-sleeping bride. I'd shaken off the willies with which I'd awakened. Life was good again. Stupid cat. Freaky gnomes. I'd taken off a few days from work so that we could get settled. I wanted to sleep in, but Princess Sweetfeet and Master Skunk Britches simply wouldn't allow it. Grandma had brought over fresh breakfast. The smell lifted me from the bed like one of those old cartoons, drawing me along by the nose until I made it to the dining room. Karen could cook very well, but there was nothing like Mom's breakfast. I was last to arrive, mostly. I had a child clinging to each leg as I shuffled in the room. I wonder how I'd manage with 3 of the little critters. Oh well, the giggles made it all worthwhile, and the biscuits and bacon helped too. We spent the day unpacking and putting away clothes and other items that we would need before the end of the week. I considered working on the backyard, but I knew that the backyard would be fine for a while. Still, with all the dream noises from last night, my unusual lack of curiosity about that area gave way to a need to know. Was it just a dream? Had something happened overnight? I made my way to the back patio, a sliding glass affair, outdated, but it sealed well enough and included a flimsy aluminum secure bar. Sure enough, the backyard was pristine, as picture-perfect as it had been yesterday. The doorway was already open slightly. Karen? Kids? Grandparents? I could hear birdsong in the late morning air, but it seemed distant, as if all the nearby trees, but not in ours. Odd. The gnomes appeared to be in place. Were a couple shifted slightly from their original position? Was someone playing that old game of move the gnomes or gnome on a shelf or whatever? Maybe. Maybe the cat or cats had been fooling around out back. That Tom was pretty big. A brush with its body might move a gnome. There was one under the azalea. He looked angry. His rake was across his chest like a soldier with a rifle at port arms. Was he always like that? I wondered where the big black kitty might be, but I didn't see it. Just as I was about to go inside, I noticed a tabby strutting along the top of the fence to my left. Typical cat, head up, not a care in the world, as it balanced perfectly on the 2x4 brace. It acted as though I, the owner of the place, didn't even exist. Cats. I looked at each gnome, trying to picture them as they were in case they moved or changed expressions again. I thought about just taking some photos on my super dork phone, but about that time, Will started squealing about something that sounded like a "I have a new boo-boo" cry. So I went to check on him, my memory and concern about the gnomes and cats fading, and my curiosity once again subsiding. Weird. Fortunately, it was only a bruised head from running heedlessly through the house. Grandma had rescued my little boy. No need for a mere dad, but he was not calming. He kept pointing towards the hall closet just off the living room. He looked more scared than hurt. He was pretty tough when it came to falls and bangs. Maybe something had startled him. I went over to check the closet, all the time wondering if he had reached the boogeyman stage a little early. The door was slightly ajar, but there was nothing inside. Just a few gray and white hairs on the carpet, just at the corner of the door frame. I wonder if the cleaners had missed some of poor Mrs. Richmond's hair, or whether we had a mouse in the house. I made a mental note to call an exterminator. We really should have done that before the move, but we were bound to forget something. Will had finally calmed and was quietly chewing on his own thumb in Grandma's lap. Current crisis resolved. I walked over and kissed my mother on top of her head and thanked her for employing her heroic lap. I knelt by her and decided to cut me some slack. He opened his arms and clutched me, snuffling. "Daddy!" He knew how to work this. I took him in my arms and plopped down on the couch next to Mama. She smiled in that way that experienced child raisers have. "He'll live, this time." As she said the last, she teasingly grabbed at Will's tummy and elicited a giggle. We sat and made small talk for a while, mainly about yet-to-be completed moving tasks. Then she asked, "Are you going to keep feeding Mrs. Richmond's cats? They're pretty good about staying on your side of the fence, but we always welcome them. They keep the population of snakes and mice to a minimum." I thought a moment. Well, since you put it that way, it might be a good idea. Wouldn't want some nasty copperhead to get a hold of my princess or my skunk britches boy. I tickled Will and he shouted, "I'm not skunk britches." He did what toddlers eventually do and squirmed away to the floor to run towards his next adventure, likely some version of annoying his big sister. "Say, Ma, how many cats did Mrs. Richmond have?" She cocked her head in the normal way she did when ciphering. "I'm not sure, but I believe there was one of each kind." She smiled. "Seriously, I think no more than 5 or 6. Do you know what her thinking was on garden gnomes? Why she had the things? I asked in an innocent tone as I could manage. Why, no. This time she frowned and looked down, trying to remember. I don't think I recall seeing any gnomes. Where exactly are they? Oh, all over the backyard. Not the best-looking decorations, and I'm afraid the kids... Okay, will break them or get hurt trying to wrestle with them. She looked up. Well, that explains it. I've rarely caught even a glimpse of the backyard. In 37 years as a neighbor? I exclaimed a little incredulously. We just had no cause. We or the Johnsons were the 2 families that hosted backyard events. The Richmonds were very quiet, private people. Poor lady. I so hate to see her suffer. We used to have conversations through the fence when we were both out back. Just howdy-do and weather stuff, but it was a fun game for us. I just don't recall much of anything about the backyard. Certainly no gnomes. I do recall, though, that she said that her family had come over from Germany right after the war. I think her maiden name was Gribble, something like that. She was born here, though. Don't gnomes come from that part of the world? About that time, Karen and Grandpa arrived from the back patio. Okay, a small rectangle of concrete by the back, sliding door. They'd been talking over coffee. Karen got along very well with my folks. They had been watching the cats and hadn't really paid attention to the statues. Karen spoke over her shoulder to Dad. I agree, that big tomcat has to go. It could hurt the kiddos, especially the new one. As she said the last, she instinctively touched her swelling tummy in a protective way. I know, Kay. I was just thinking that cats can be handy, and you never seen one of those get close enough to pet, much less be a menace. Of course, when you get a dog... They broke off, and we all joined in an innocuous conversation that drifted from memory soon after, as all inconsequential things do. Oddly, I forgot to ask Dad about the garden gnomes. Maybe he'd known something useful. Perhaps I should just get rid of the things. I forgot that thought as I'd forgotten the small talk earlier. My memory was suffering. At least, when it came to the backyard. Karen and I discussed it the next morning. It was my last day off before returning to work, and I wanted to get in some playtime with my brats, and maybe wear 'em out a little so Mom could get some things done. When I was no longer there, to keep them out of her hair. Besides, I liked playing in the yard. At least I had. Seems I'd once again forgotten about the other denizens of our green space. So Karen and I both went out to keep an eye on the young ones as they explored their new territory for the first time. We walked around and showed them the plants and shrubs and told them the name of each. Ellie was fascinated and repeated each name until she was able to pronounce them correctly. Well, mostly. She was only 4. Okay, 4.5. I liked it better when she used to hold up fingers and declared, "This many." Will couldn't care less. He saw and jumped towards everything. Every insect, every bird, and even the cliché, "Squirrel!" Each time squealing in delight and running towards the poor creatures. I rescued a cricket from his tiny fist, and we decided to take a cookie break. I went to the kitchen and picked up the last 4 Grandma's special cookies. They were her secret recipe, large, soft-baked, and addicting. Karen and Ellie sat on the small bench on the patio to savor their treats. I had to stuff mine in my mouth as I handed smaller pieces of Will's cookie to him. If he couldn't finish the entire thing, well, I didn't want to eat the leftover portion covered in toddler slobber. Will had made his way around to the rose bush by the patio. He squatted to pick up something and carefully held up his cookie and away from the ground. I stuffed my cookie back into my maw and prepared to rescue some other tiny critter. I was momentarily distracted by movement where the fence met the edge of the house. Tom Salem, as we started to call the big black tomcat, had apparently been spying from his favorite tree limb and had decided to noisily surrender his perch. Then an angry squall from Will got everyone's attention. He stood there glaring at the gnome by the rose bush. He looked indignant and a little startled. His piece of cookie, slobber and all, had disappeared, and I assumed he'd dropped it. He pointed at the gnome and screamed out his recent discovered favorite word, "No!" and his close second favorite word, "Mine!" The gnome simply stood there smiling broadly and looking very satisfied. As it always had? I don't remember that expression. They had all worn fairly stern, if neutral expressions, but this was a very broad and noticeable smile. The rest of its face remained stern, like a man who rarely smiled but just couldn't help himself. Will, temper up, struck out at the statue and boinked it on the noggin. The angry cry became an injured boo-hoo cry. So much for a serene afternoon in the backyard. Between the gnome, the cat, and the brat, it was time to go inside. At least for the boy and me. This time Daddy Care had to suffice. Maybe Will would learn not to hit things with a harder head than his own. I set down the remainder of my cookie and picked up my little boy and took him inside our home. The girls stayed outside to watch Tom Salem stock the garden for a while. I sat Boo-Hoo Boy down on the couch for a short recovery nap. I heard something out in the backyard, an unpleasant-sounding something. Then Karen burst through the back doorway. Ellie clutched to her, quietly crying with her mom stroking her little back. "It's all right, sweetie. It's just what animals do sometimes. Remember the nature shows?" I approached and added my own comforting pats and comments. Daddy's girl clutched at me, and shortly she was stretched out on the other end of the couch from Will, both sleeping off their adventures. I rejoined Karen in the kitchen, where she poured us each a glass of iced tea. So what was that all about? She sighed. We were watching Tom Salem hunt. You know how cats are always stalking as if they're moving at all. It was fun at first. He hunted and walked around, trying to look cool. He even made a few clumsy leaps at some of the larger flying insects. Ellie loved that. She was delighted. Then he spied a squirrel as it crept out of one of the oaks and sat on the ground nibbling at something. Next there was a swirling, squawking furball. Looked like the Tasmanian devil. Tom took out Mr. Squirrel. Never knew such a small animal could hold so much blood. I looked over to the sliding glass door, just in time to see Tom Salem place a portion of dead squirrel by the door, lock eyes with me briefly, and then swirl away, on to his next hunt. I shook my head. Apparently he was making overtures to become our cat. I mentally noted to clean up the mess before Karen or the kids saw it. I gave a silent thanks that Karen was faced away from the sight. I soon forgot about the backyard in general, and the gnomes in particular. By now, the specific lapses in memory had become my natural response to backyard occurrences. Just as well. I have found that my cookie and the squirrel shank had disappeared. I went back to work, and we all started falling into the habit of domestic bliss. Other than a few mysterious open interior doors, not much happened until next Friday. After work, I thought it would be nice to relax on the back porch, like my dad used to do after work, especially on nice days. I mixed a drink and plopped into one of the chairs at Mrs. Richmond's, now our patio set. The kids were playing together in Will's room. Ellie had apparently decided to cut him some slack. I guess he hadn't broken anything of hers in a day or two. Time to enjoy some peace while it lasted. I fell into a light doze, just on the edge of lucidity, when I had the feeling that something was staring at me. Probably just my imagination, I thought. Please be my imagination. I need to unwind. No such luck. I pried my eyes open to discover the offending Perrys. The cats. Tom Salem and 3 of his minions. Maybe harem? Who knows with cats? Of course, Tom was pretty cool, wasn't he? He was perched on the fence by his favorite oak. The gray with dark stripes and a spot of white on her tummy was seated at the edge of the patio. The orange tabby, which Karen had dubbed Mrs. Garfield, was nosing around the fountain, and a pretty little calico was eyeing a bird or lizard hidden behind the azalea bush, likely with torture and murder on her mind. Cats. Don't get me wrong, I like them. Didn't I? Maybe. I forget. I was simply not accustomed to so many at once. I looked at Tom and said aloud, "Bad Tom, you scared my little princess." Ah, well, I guess it's your nature. He winked at me. He actually winked. I was a little startled by that, but then the gray meowed and demanded attention. I had no idea why. She just stared at me. Hungry? I asked innocently, but with no intention of giving up my piece to get food for the little trespasser. It just stared with its gray-green, gigantic eyes. Lady Gray, I mentally dubbed her. Definitely a girl kitty. Eventually one. Karen had bought some cat food a few days ago. Apparently I'd agreed so that we should feed the cats, at least in her mind. I rose a little gruffly and walked into the sliding door into the kitchen. I had a vague notion where Karen may have hid the kitty chow. As I squatted to see and reached the bottom shelf, bingo, that's when I felt the stare again. As I closed the pantry door, there sat Lady Gray, licking her chops expectantly, as though she'd been invited into the house. Cats. Karen nudged me and handed me 3 small, colorful dishes, the cheap plastic kind. I found these just around the corner from the patio. Mrs. Richmond's, no doubt. Have fun with your new little friends. She grinned. I gave her my best put-upon look, then grinned back and kissed her quickly. I filled each of the dishes and decided to place them strategically around the yard. Lady Gray wouldn't wait, so I placed hers on the patio on the side with the rose bush. Calico Kate quickly joined her. Plans for torture and murder abandoned. I put another near Tom Salem's tree and a third by the fountain. The clutter of cats, with an obvious air of entitlement rather than gratitude, made short work of the small dishes. Now, maybe a little rest for moi? I'd no sooner resumed my seat than the usual odd feelings intruded, along with a chill. The gnomes. They had to be up to something. I looked and noticed that the area near the patio on the side with the rose bush was very neatly trimmed and immaculate as always. The gnome that had smiled so broadly had resumed his more neutral look. Had he actually smiled bigger before? Yet the rest of the yard had started to look a tiny bit ragged. Still very nice, but not quite near the perfection it had been. I guess that I'd be gardening soon. As for the rest of the gnomes, they were each faced mostly away towards the back fence. From what I could see, they all wore indignant expressions. They had certainly not always been the case. I felt a strong sense of unease and decided it was time to go inside and check on the young'uns. Much too quiet was a bad sign with them. Then I was going to do some research on gnomes, garden variety or otherwise. However, that darkening of the daylight happened, and I noticed a musky, sweet, foul stench coming from over the back fence near the woods. I took one of the patio chairs over to the fence. There were strangely no gates in the entire structure. I put the chair against the fence and clambered onto it to peer into the unknown. Yep. Over near the woodline was a bundle of crusty-looking black and white fur, from which emanated the odor of death. Apparently, Tom Salem had lost a member of his harem several days ago. Maybe that was what I heard the first night. Coyotes or stray dogs slaughtering the poor cat. I looked along the bottom of the fence line to ensure that nothing had been digging. I'd have to ask Mom and Dad about vermin in the area. Maybe the neighbors on the other side. The Johnsons had moved out years prior, but the older couple seemed nice enough. I lugged the chair back to its table and went inside. Had I intended to look up something on the interwebs? I told Karen about the dead cat out back and suggested that maybe we should keep the kiddos out of the backyard till I could get over the fence and bury the carcass. She agreed, and before we went to bed, I checked work emails to see if anything just wouldn't wait for tomorrow. Then I remembered my earlier mission. Miracle. My memory about the backyard actually worked. I didn't find much. I searched garden gnomes, but found articles mostly about where to buy the things. Nope. Some of the ones pictured were funny. I liked the one flipping the bird and holding the sign that said "Go away." Near the bottom of the search results, I found some information about traditional gnomes being based on ancient Germanic beliefs. Gnomes were small folk who were mostly good-natured, but who could be mischievous or even spiteful if angered. The best way to keep them happy was to feed them, offering of food and drink. Especially sweets and milk would keep them happy, and they would even assist with household chores, especially with growing things. Apparently, that's why they became garden gnomes. Some belief, no doubt engendered by a 16th century sales department, that the statues would bring about order and assist with growing and cultivating around a homestead. Not much help. We were already feeding the cats, and I really liked them. Didn't I? Did I always like cats? I did not, however, care much for the garden gnomes, except maybe the one by the rose bush, the one with the hatchet. After all, his area was neat and, well, after all, he'd gotten a piece of Will's cookie and almost half of mine. Certainly he had a reason to be content. Nah, couldn't be. Maybe? I'd have to study on it. I went to bed and once again faced the nightmares and chills. I saw over the back fence, the way one can magically see and do things in dreams. The dead cat had risen and was standing on her hind legs, glaring at me with glowing red, accusing eyes. Behind her, shapes moved about the trees, and the wind rose and whipped. In the lower limbs, figures began to take shape. Spindly arms and legs on squarish trunks, with spiky heads and long talons on hands and feet. They swayed in the trees and looked down with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. The fence disappeared, and to either side of me, I saw the shapes of cones rising and cold steel implements glittering in the moonlight. The gnomes. The cones were their hats. From directly behind me, I heard an ear-splitting, hair-raising yowl. That was it for me. I jolted awake in a cold sweat. Karen slept on peacefully beside me. I had that weird feeling like something was watching me. I tried to shake it off by hitting the bathroom for a relaxing pee. I was far too rattled to go back to sleep. I decided to look in on the children. Will was zonked out in that way that only babies can be. Not a stir. In Ellie's room, she twitched and turned over in her sleep. Her window was open, and it was very cool in her room. The room was lit by a weak outdoor lighting from the patio that penetrated the single window. Then I saw it. The silhouette of a large figure in a pointy cap. It stood as though frozen in place outside my little girl's window. Couldn't make out features, but something about the face looked rough, maybe bearded. I quickly moved to the window and pushed aside the curtains, prepared to defend my Ellie. I caught a shadow that darted into deeper shadows near the fence that connected to my parents' backyard. A dark figure used the corner to clamber over the fence and was quickly gone. I closed the window and started to dash outside, but Ellie stirred and in a groggy voice asked, "Are you okay, Daddy? I was having a bad dream." I reassured her and told her it was safe to go back to sleep. I forced myself to calmly walk out the door. I headed towards the back door, stopping only to pick up my home defense baseball bat. Nothing out back. I rushed back through the house and over to my parents' house. They had a gate on their backyard that faced the front yard. I looked over to see if I could see anything. Stupid, I forgot the flashlight. I internally admonished myself. However, the backyard was well lit enough to see that there was nothing outside the shadows. The front porch light came on and I saw Dad open the back door. "Dad, it's me, Clayton." As I said it, I stepped into the light with my hands up, bat and all, I knew that it was likely that my dad had answered the door with his shotgun in hand. He had. Shortly, Dad, Mom, and I were seated at their small kitchen table drinking coffee. We talked about the intruder or peeping Tom for a while, and waited on the local constabulary to arrive. They took their time. Apparently, with no crook currently in sight or in the process of murdering us, it wasn't a high priority. The officers arrived and checked the backyards. They brought their flashlights. They used Dad's ladder to step up and check my side of the fence. The female officer looked down at me from her perch on the ladder. "Sir, no sign of anyone in your yard, just some cats. Are they maybe what caused the disturbance?" I shook my head. "No, they're usually very quiet. Oh, and they don't stand close to 6 foot tall and run on 2 legs. Just saying." She suppressed a snicker. She'd been pretty cool and appeared to be competent. An older officer with a gut that covered his belt buckle grunted, "We'll patrol the area tonight and keep an extra sharp eye out for any creepers. Maybe some started cutting through the woods from the new strip center. We'll check there as well. Try and get some rest and maybe consider a dog or a burglar alarm. You folks have a good night." The two of them each clambered into a patrol car, and they slowly rumbled off into the night. Dad looked at Mom. "We're getting another dog," he said emphatically. She nodded. "Yep. Don't want you blasting anybody with that shotgun of yours, Doc Holliday." I come by my smart-ass nature, honestly. We said our goodbyes, and I sneaked back into the house and checked the children again. Will was still zonked. Ellie had quieted. I patted over and closed her window and locked it. I noticed several gray and white hairs on the sill. Odd, like the ones from the hall closet. I'd have to look into this. Maybe from the prowler? I moved on to Karen's and my room and crawled back into bed with my deep sleeping love. I wanted a dog too, but in any case would have to do something. I was pretty scared for my family, and I placed the bat within easy reach. I told Karen about it at breakfast. Not sure if the cops even believed us. At least me. It was weird, though. The pointy hat and rough features. He had a beard, I think. I trailed off, sinking into darker thoughts. Maybe start with a brighter light out back. The back patio light doesn't even reach the back fence, and spooky trees. She said the last in a silly, creepy voice and waggled her eyebrows. I grinned and kissed her, squeezed her butt, then fled out the front door and headed next door to consult with my folks. At least having a house wasn't boring. So quoth this raven. Well, my darlings, I will have part 2 for you next week. After my bedtime stories on Sunday and after the campground story on Tuesday. So bear with me. This is just a 2-parter. I appreciate you all stopping by my little library to enjoy the stories I tell. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and, of course, Charlotte Emerson. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.